Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joel Schweitzer. I'm the director of AJC Dallas. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about Israel's new governing coalition. Thank you to Southern Methodist University for co-sponsoring today's program, and a special thank you to my colleague, AJC Project Interchange Director, Nisha Abkarian, for moderating the Q&A segment of our program today. We're so happy to have both Project Interchange alumni and supporters and friends of AJC Dallas and the Tower Center and its faculty and students. So with that, let me take the great pleasure of introducing my dear friend and AJC Project Interchange alumna, Luisa Del Rosal, Executive Director of the John G. Tower Center for Public Policy and International Affairs at SMU. Luisa.
Thank you, dear Joel. It's always a pleasure when we get to collaborate with AJC and with you and with Amy. And as a Project Interchange alum, this is even more special for me because I love that you all have a point of getting us engaged, and the Tower Center is a great partner, and we love partnering with you all. So today's program will feature one of our local talents, Dr. Shaheen Varenji, and in conversation with the Jerusalem Post, Herb Keinon. It is really a pleasure. Dr. Varenji is a Colin Powell Teaching Fellow here at the SMU Tower Center. He received his PhD in political science from UCLA. His latest publication, Sadat and the Road to Jerusalem, Bold Gestures and Risk Acceptance in the Search for Peace, recently appeared in International Security in the summer of 2020. Herb is a senior contributing editor and analyst at the Jerusalem Post. He writes extensively on diplomacy, politics, and Israeli society today. So this is going to be a really phenomenal conversation. And he's been at the paper for 35 years, 20 of those as its diplomatic correspondent. And during his time, he has covered some of the most major stories that has shaped the Israeli nation for more than 3 decades. He lectures widely in Israel and around the world on political and diplomatic developments in the country. He has a BA in political science from the University of Colorado Boulder, an MA in journalism from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. For the audience, thank you all for joining us. It's really a pleasure. Remember, just a quick reminder, you are invited to submit your questions at any time using the program function, the Zoom's Q&A feature, so please do so. And as a last, I just want to thank my colleague, Ray Rafidi, here as Senior Associate Director of the Tower Center, for really thinking about this program and collaborating with Joel and his team to make it happen. So Shaheen, I will stop speaking because you all are really who everybody wants to listen to, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Louisa, for that kind introduction. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. On March 23rd, Israelis went to the polls for the 4th time in under 2 years. And the results of that election, as in prior elections, were inconclusive. On June 3rd, Yair Lapid, the leader of the largest party of the anti-Netanyahu bloc, or what has been referred to as the Change bloc, announced that he could form a government with the support of 8 very different political parties. Shortly after, on June 13th, the Knesset, Israel's parliament, voted to approve the formation of this new government led by the young 49-year-old Naftali. So this is Israel's 36th government, and it has a change in leadership, and this has brought about an end to Benjamin Netanyahu's 12-year tenure as prime minister. So Herb, how was this coalition assembled, and who exactly is part of Israel's new government?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. How was it assembled? Look, it was assembled after a great deal of struggle, a great deal of sweat, 4 elections when it seemed like the option was going to be either this government or you're going to a 5th election. Right? Everyone agreed pretty much that a 5th election would be a disaster, and that a narrow, very diverse government would be the preferred option, with the idea being, well, if this works, great. If it doesn't work, well, we'll go back to elections. So there's not a lot here to lose.
And there's a great deal of diversity in this coalition government. So what types of parties do you have here? They kind of range across the political spectrum, don't they?
Yeah, diversity here, that's an understatement. I mean, it's an incredibly diverse government. It goes from the far left it goes from the hard left to the hard right. It's a coalition of 8 different parties. 3 of them, Bennett's Yamina party, Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope party, and Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu are all pretty right-wing parties in the sense of right-wing being on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Right, you have two parties in the middle. You have the biggest party that got 17 seats, Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party, and then you have another party, the blue and white party of Benny Gantz. On the left, you have the hard left Meretz party, and you have the Labor Party, and then you have a party which is kind of tough to classify in traditional left-right terms, and that's the United Arab List, the Ram Party, which is an extremely significant development here because this is the first time that you've had an Arab party in the coalition. You've had Arab MKs inside the government and even as deputy ministers in the past, but they were part of Jewish parties, not Arab parties. So that's a big change, and it's tough to kind of categorize the Arab List party as right or left because obviously on the Palestinian issue it's left, but when it comes to domestic issues, right, this is a conservative Islamist party, right? If you're talking about, gay rights, which is a big issue for Meretz and for Labor, this Islamist party is very much opposed. So it is indeed a diverse party. You have the former head of the Settlement Council, Bennett, right? He used to head the Yesh Council for Settlements with former heads of Peace Now inside Meretz. You have Islamists sitting with religious Zionists and gay rights activists. To put it in American terms, somebody wrote something that I thought was pretty clever. They said, in American terms, this would be like the equivalent of replacing Donald Trump with Lynn Cheney. But Cheney is unable to pass any legislation without the consent of Bernie Sanders, Nancy Pelosi, Ilhan Omar, and Mitt Romney. And in 2 years, Cheney herself will be trading places with Chuck Schumer, right? That's the kind of government we have now. Welcome to Israel 2021.
Well, it seems like definitely there's a hodgepodge or a patchwork of parties there in that new coalition government. Israel had its elections on March 23rd, and we're now in June. So it took quite a long time for this government to form. What were some of the factors that delayed the formation of this new government?
Well, first of all, what happens after the elections, whoever gets the most recommendations from the parties to form a government has the right to try to form a government. This is a period that lasts 45 days. That devolved on Netanyahu, right? Netanyahu had the first shot to put together a government. He failed to do so. Then it went over to Yair Lapid, who was the next guy in line. Lapid is a general rule of thumb here, by the way. Whenever they form coalitions after elections, it always goes down to the deadline. It always goes down to the deadline because this is negotiations between parties, and they're all trying to leverage whatever they can. It's all brinkmanship until the last moment. It looked as if Lapid was going to do it a little bit earlier. On May 10th, it appeared as he had a government, but on May 10th that night, about 2 hours after Bennett said he was going to go into this government, the rockets started to fall on Israel from Gaza, right? The start of the military confrontation with Hamas in Gaza. That looked like it was going to put this whole thing in jeopardy, because one of the things that happened as a result of that war was you saw unprecedented rioting among Israeli Arabs in Israeli cities. And it looked then that it would be very difficult for Bennett from a right-wing party to then go into a government supported and leaning on an Arab party. And Bennett actually, in the second day of the war, said, this government's off, it's over. What happened, though, is that the head of the RAM, the head of the United Arab List, Mansour Abbas, went to one of these towns where they were rioting, made some very conciliatory comments, went to a synagogue that was burned down. And then after the war was over, Bennett kind of changed his mind and he went in with them. So that's what took it so long. But again, it's not rare here for all the coalition wrangling to always go down to the last minute?
So who exactly is Naftali Bennett? I mean, he's a young 49-year-old politician of the Yamina party, the leader of the Yamina party. And how exactly did Naftali Bennett rise through Israeli politics at such a young age to become prime minister, especially given that his party holds something like 7 to 8 seats in the 120-seat Knesset, and is actually a relatively small party in comparison to the other members of the anti-Netanyahu or change bloc?
Right. I mean, that's a good question. Like, I mean, Bennett, I mean, his biography, I think, is pretty well known. He came into the Knesset in 2013 as the head of a rejuvenated religious Zionist party. He's the son of immigrant parents. His parents immigrated to Israel from San Francisco. He spoke English in the home. He's religious. He's the first kippah wearing, the first yarmulke wearing prime minister the country's ever had. He's married to a non-religious woman, or a woman who doesn't define herself as religious. He's a veteran of the commando unit here, the elite commando unit, the same one that Netanyahu was in. High-tech entrepreneur, right? Millionaire, built up company, then sold it and made millions of dollars. He's the former head, like I said, of the settlement committee. If Yitzhak Rabin's biography kind of represented the founding father generation, right? He was the warrior who was very direct. He went to an agricultural school. He had very kind of Spartan lifestyle. I think to a large extent, Bennett now represents Israel today, right? He's religious, but not overwhelmingly so. He's very capitalistic. He supports the right in the settlements, although he lives in the affluent neighborhood of affluent suburb of Tel Aviv called Ra'anana. So I think he's a pretty good representative face of what makes up a large part of at least the Jewish population in this country. How did he become to be prime minister? Even though he only commands 7 seats, he won 7 seats in the election. One guy has since defected. So essentially he commands 6 seats out of 120. How did he do it? He did it because he's a darn good politician.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to rise through the ranks of Israeli politics and to become prime minister at such a young age, especially over the past few months to become the prime minister of this new coalition government, definitely took a lot of skill. Many in the international community view Naftali Bennett as a hardliner, as a member of more of the hard right wing in Israel. However, the government he's helped form includes, as you pointed out earlier, a party that represents the Palestinian minority in Israel, the Ram party. And I was wondering if you could, tell me a little bit about how the inclusion of that Arab party might impact the new policies of Israel's coalition government.
Look, I think Ram is an exceptionally significant event in Israeli political history, right? I mean, this is the first time that an Arab party is inside of the government. It's going to have significance as far as the Israeli Arab population, right? Up until now, the Israeli Arabs, again, there's been Arab MKs of other parties, but not of an Arab party. And what's going to happen now is the Arab party is going to be around the table, when they allocate resources. And I think this is a huge thing. If you want to get crumbs, you got to be around the table. Up until now, they weren't around the table. So I think you're going to see a much larger budgets right now going to Ram, because you're going to need them to stay into the coalition, and budgets helps parties stay in the coalition. So you're going to see much more budgets going to the Arab municipalities. There'll be much more money going to fight crime in the Arab communities. This is a huge problem. One of the major problems facing the Israeli Arab community right now is the crime in the streets there. So because you have an Arab party inside the government where the decisions are being made and where the resources are being allocated, I think you can expect to see that they're going to get much more, which is why which is why this party went into the government to start off with, because there was a lot of objection on the Arab street to them doing this for ideological reasons. So the impact will be felt, I think, on Israeli domestic issues. But when it comes to security issues, when it comes to the Palestinians, when it comes to Iran, I don't think there's going to be much impact there. Number one, because this isn't the high priority of this party, and number two, when it comes to security, Israel or this government is not going to parcel that out to an Israeli Arab party. I think you can even say that we've seen this in the last 2 weeks. The government has been in power now for just over 2 weeks, and you had an interesting situation in Gaza where following the war, the statement here was, well, if there's any other rockets or missiles or even incendiary balloons being flown into Israel, Israel will take action. And Hamas tested the new government early. They sent over balloons 2 days running, and Bennett did something that Netanyahu didn't do, and he responded to balloons, right? And that's even though you had this Arab party inside the government. As far as Iran, there was in Syria, there's been a couple of incidences that have been purportedly, reportedly Israel carried out in Syria. Last week, there was this incident, drone sabotage on a centrifuge plant in Iran. I don't know who did it. Some speculate it might be Israel. So this happened perhaps under this government. So again, I think when it comes to security issues, you're not going to see a big influence from the Arab Party, but when it comes to domestic issues, you will.
And just to follow up on that, what does the inclusion of a party that represents the Palestinian minority in Israel, what does that mean for Israeli politics? Has a precedent been set here in this election that future Israeli governments might be inclined to also include these types of parties in future governments?
Definitely. I mean, this is a watershed moment, and again, it goes both ways. By the way, it wasn't only that Israeli coalitions didn't want to have Arab parties, and again, I make the distinction between Arab parties and Arabs because there have been Arabs in the government. The reason there was objection to Arab parties was because in the past these parties were very ideological, oftentimes fervently anti-Zionist. They didn't recognize legitimacy of Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people. For governments in the past, this was something that was anathema, and also for the Arab parties themselves, they were not keen on cooperating with governments that were perhaps building settlements or whatnot. Along comes the Ram party, and it changes the paradigm. And I think it's interesting to kind of connect this to what happened with the Abraham Accords, right? The Abraham Accords, the accords that Israel signed last fall with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco, with Sudan. By the way, today, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid was the first minister to fly to the UAE, dedicated the new embassy there. That was a watershed moment in the Middle East, and I also think it had a trickle-down effect on the Israeli Arab streets. What do I mean by that? Up until this time, right, there were parties, Israeli Arab parties, who had, in the last election, they had 15 seats, which is a lot, but they wouldn't want to go into a government. They wouldn't want to deal with Netanyahu. Say, how can we deal with Netanyahu when he's doing what he's doing in the settlements with the Palestinians or whatever, right? We don't agree with his diplomatic policies. We're not going to play ball with him. Along comes the United Arab Emirates, and they say, hey, I mean, the Israeli Arabs see the United Arab Emirates. They're willing to deal with a Netanyahu government. They're willing to deal with a right-wing government. That there's no real diplomatic horizon at this time with the Palestinians. And why do they do it? Because it's in their interest. Because Israel has what to offer those countries. So I think what Mansour Abbas was able to do was say, hey, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. If they can deal with a right-wing government, then I should be able to do so as well for the same reason in order to get things from my constituents. So I think it's interesting to kind of link the dots between what happened in the Abraham Accords and this very breakthrough moment in Israeli politics.
And how do Palestinians, either those who live in Israel or those who live outside of Israel in the in the West Bank or Gaza Strip, what's the perception among Palestinians in those two groups? I mean, do they view this government as being just a tad bit different than the previous government in terms of possibly its policies towards the Palestinians or possibly its policies towards the settlement? Uh, the reason I ask that is this government there's so much ideological diversity in this new government. There's so many differences between the parties. So I imagine that the existing parties might just continue the status quo, or how do I phrase this? Would the existing parties might not want to deal with issues that may expose their divisions?
That's definitely the case. I mean, I think there's no doubt about it, right? I mean, the glue that cemented these disparate parties together was a dislike, a distaste for Netanyahu, right? The major number one goal of this coalition, oddly enough, right, was achieved and the minute after it was sworn in, right? Because that goal was to move Netanyahu aside, right? They achieved that on the first day, right? So now what? Now what holds them together? The glue that holds them together now, I think, to a certain extent, is political survival, because 4 of the 8 parties, Mansour Abbas's party, Ram, Bennett's party, the New Hope party, and even Meretz, those parties, if elections were held today, it's not clear how they would do, whether they would even get back into the Knesset. So I think at least half of this coalition realizes that their political future, right, rides on their success, on the ability of this government to work and operate and to provide for the basic needs of the country. So political survival, I think, is the big glue. Now, in order for that political survival to happen, you're going to have to, stay away from those issues that are ideologically very divisive. Right? You're not going to see any breakthrough right now on the Palestinian issue because there's too many different components inside the government. Right? It's just not going to happen under this government. As far as the settlements, you're not going to see any big changes in settlement policies because that is an ideological issue that would bring down the government. This government wants to just deal with domestic issues on things in which even parties from the right and the left, they can agree on, right? And there are a lot of issues, right? A lot of issues that those parties can agree on. And also, you got to remember as well where the Israeli public is coming to in this as well. I mean, we've come out of, a 2.5-year election cycle, 4 elections in 2.5 years. As you know, in America, right, elections are not love fests. These are extremely divisive periods. So the country, the population just wants a government that will work, right? Without the bickering, without the divisiveness, without having to deal every day with, is Netanyahu a scoundrel or is he a saint? Is he guilty or is innocent, right? They just want some industrial quiet so that the government can just do what it's supposed to do. And that's, provide basic needs of the people. That's what the population wants. I think that's what the coalition partners, all the parties realize they're there for. So I think that they will try to minimize anything that will cause ideological division.
Shortly after the election, Netanyahu was given a mandate to form a coalition government. He was ultimately unable to do so, but did Netanyahu's willingness to court the United Arab List or the Ram Party led by Mansour Abbas, Netanyahu's willingness to just talk to them about possibly entering a Likud-led coalition government, did that, in your opinion, make it much easier for Naftali, Bennett, or Yair Lapid to then later on go, when they're given the mandate, to ask Mansour Abbas, hey, would you like to join our coalition?
Yes, I mean, undoubtedly so, right? Look, there's a saying here in Israel that's been true for the last almost half a century, and that's only the Likud can, right? Only Likud can do certain things, right? Only Menachem Begin was able to make peace with Anwar Sadat, right? If Shimon Peres was the prime minister at the time, that probably wouldn't have happened because Begin would have been screaming from the bleachers, and the right would have prevented him from doing it. Only Ariel Sharon could have uprooted the settlements in Gaza. Only somebody who came from the right wing could do that. And the same is true here, because there was a certain ideological line that had to be crossed, saying it's okay to deal with anti-Zionist or non-Zionist Arab parties who don't recognize the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state. It's okay to deal with them, right? Now, Netanyahu did that, not because he fell in love with the idea, because he was thinking about his own political survival. Once he did that, right, he couldn't scream at Bennett, although he is, right? He couldn't scream at Bennett and say, well, you can't deal with them. They're outside the bounds. So yes, to a large degree, he gave the, in Hebrew you said the hechsher, he gave the kashrut, he gave the okay for this type of negotiation to take place. And had he not done it, I find it hard to believe that Bennett would have been able to do so.
So to follow up on that, in light of all the ideological differences between members of the coalition government, you said that one thing they're likely to agree on is domestic issues. Could you go over what domestic issues they're likely to tackle over the next year or two?
Yeah, first of all, it's a budget. I mean, the country hasn't had a budget in 2.5 years, which makes the function of the ministries very difficult. They've been working off a budget from 2018. So the first thing they're going to want to tackle is to give the country a 2-year budget, and I think they'll be able to do that fairly simply. Second thing is COVID, right? COVID was hugely politicized under Netanyahu government. And now you have a new government which doesn't have the same political obligations that Netanyahu had. What do I mean by that? You mentioned that there's a large Arab minority in Israel, 20%. 13% of the country are ultra-Orthodox, what are called Haredim. During the whole Corona crisis, it appeared that there were like these autonomous ultra-Orthodox zones in the country where the government would say to do X, Y, and Z, don't send your kids to school. But in these areas, they weren't abiding by those regulations. This caused a great deal of resentment and a great deal of frustration among those parts of the Israeli population that did abide by those regulations. And Netanyahu did not enforce the country's rules and regulations across the board, right? All across the country into these areas. Why not? Because the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, were a very big part of his coalition, right? And if they would have left his coalition, his government would have fallen. So he was limited in his ability to deal equitably across the board with Corona, because he had political obligations to the ultra-Orthodox parties. This new government doesn't have ultra-Orthodox inside it, right? I mean, sometimes you hear people call the government a unity government, or national unity government. I'm not sure you can really justifiably call it a national unity government if 13% of the population aren't represented inside of it. It's a unity government. It's not national unity, but they don't have the ultra-Orthodox inside. So I think that, as far as dealing with Corona, you'll see kind of a much different approach. You also see a different approach to the whole relationship inside Israel between the ultra-Orthodox community and the general population.
Yeah, and COVID is still affecting it's still affecting the politics inside Israel as it is in other countries as well. How is the COVID situation right now in Israel?
Look, it was great. A week ago on Sunday, they told us to take off our masks, even inside. 2 days ago on Sunday, they told us to put our masks back on because the Delta variant came into the country. And after going a few weeks without any new cases, all of a sudden there was a spike, mostly among young people who were not inoculated. So it's, again, it's nowhere near what it was back then, but we had a certain sense here that, we were out of the woods. It looks now that the trees are growing back up again, and we're entering a little bit of the woods. Again, there's, the masks are back on. They're trying to figure out what to do at the airport, how to screen people coming in and going out. And these are issues that this new government is trying to deal with. So it was good, vaccinated country, but now, we got this new variant, so things are shifting just a bit.
So given that the new government has parties from the left wing and centrist parties and right wing parties, and that it might affect possibly its durability and longevity because so many differences might at some point just erupt out in the open and affect, as I said earlier, its durability. Is there a sense that this government might be short-lived because of these types of differences among its members?
Yeah, yes. I mean, nobody, I don't think you're going to find anybody who's going to bet on this government lasting its entire term. Plus, I remember something else. In the beginning, you mentioned, this is the end of, you didn't say the end of the Netanyahu era, which was smart. You said it was the end of Netanyahu's reign, 12-year reign. Because I think that those who say that it's the end of the Netanyahu era might be disappointed. I think it's a pause in the Netanyahu era. Netanyahu is not going anywhere, right? I mean, this isn't Donald Trump who went down to Florida and lost his Twitter account. And he's now the head of the opposition, and he can make life, and he is making life already hell for the government, right? I mean, he's made no bones about it that his overarching goal and priority right now is to bring down the government, and he's going to do everything he can to do that. So no, there's no guarantee that the government will last. The government is only going to last if if its component parts are willing to make ideological compromises, right? That's the only way it'll last. We're 2 weeks in. 2 weeks in, it looks like they're able to do that. But it's still extremely early. The way the government is set up, by the way, it's a parity government, right? It's kind of a shared power arrangement where Bennett or Lapid from the center left has a veto power over Bennett for the 2 years in which Bennett is the prime minister. And then Bennett will have a veto power for 2 years when Lapid is the prime minister. So you've got this parity, this balance. What that does is that kind of it forces compromise. It forces compromise. So if they're willing to compromise, it'll last. If they're not, if ideological issues become too much for them, and it's more important for them, for certain parties on the left, on the right, to be more ideologically pure than it is to keep Netanyahu out of power, then I think that the government is going to be short-lived.
And if there's anything that can be learned from revisiting Israeli politics, it's that you can never rule Bibi Netanyahu out. Prime Minister 1996 to 1999, and then Prime Minister continuously from 2009 to 2021. So he's definitely an adept politician. And I think he's even said repeatedly after Naftali Bennett has taken office that I'm coming back shortly, right?
Look, I just want to put those years that you mentioned into context. 96 to 99, 2009 to 2021, that's 15 years. 15 years. Now, you got to put that in context. Israel's only a country of 73 years. So you had Netanyahu ruling the country for about 21% of the country's young history. I mean, that's an astounding statistic. If you put that together with our founding prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, who ruled himself for 13 years, 2 men in the country have ruled for about 38% of the country's history. Again, that's an astounding statistic.
It is, and it's probably it played a role in bringing these parties together, despite all their differences with one another. I think after a combined 15 years, I think many other politicians or many other even parties, even those on the right wing, were looking for a change in leadership. And I think that definitely the fact that he was in office for such a long time played a role here in bringing them together.
Yeah, definitely. Look, I mean, the problem is, or I don't know, problem. The issue here is that in Israel we don't have term limits. So when you don't have term limits, what happens? And this doesn't only happen in Netanyahu. It was the same thing with Ariel Sharon. When you're a prime minister without term limits, you think you're going to rule forever, and as a result, is you don't want to cultivate any competitor. right? So you don't want to, if you see anybody coming up inside your party, right, who could, succeed you someday, you're going to push them to the side. And that's essentially what Netanyahu did. And it's incredible when you look at the lineup in the anti-Bibi camp, how many of those guys in there, including Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar, right, and Avigdor Lieberman, who are all three huge ministers in the new government, how many were once, Netanyahu allies, or they worked for him, they were his proteges. But he in the end, there was no room to move, so they moved out. Another thing to watch here, though, when you're looking at Netanyahu, is watch his trial. Right, he's on trial for bribery, for breach of trust, and for fraud. And although, because of the media leaks and all that stuff in the beginning, it looked like, well, this was kind of a slam dunk, he's going to get convicted. The way the trial is emerging right now, it's not a slam dunk, right? He might be acquitted. And if Netanyahu is acquitted at least in the bribery case, which is the biggest case, right? That's an earthquake. That's a political earthquake, because then he and the Likud will say he was hounded out of office by trumped up charges, right? So keep an eye on what happens in the trial, because it's not insignificant.
And the last question I wanted to touch on is the issue of political transitions. Political transitions are so important in democracies. This past election here in the US, our political transition was not very smooth at all. One presidential candidate kind of denied the results of the election. And there, in Israel, this political transition, I think, has been a little different than others. And I was wondering if you could touch on it. Was it a rocky transition between Netanyahu and Bennett, or was it something that you could categorize as a smooth transition from Netanyahu to the incoming Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett?
Look, the first thing I would say was that we did not have a capital moment, right? And I think there was a lot of people out here, people who disliked Netanyahu, they were saying that he was not going to leave office, they would hang on until the very last minute, and that there would be some kind of equivalent to what happened on January 6th in Washington, D.C. in Israel. That didn't happen, right? Whether it was smooth or rocky, it was angry. It was an angry transition. The way that the government works here, we're a parliamentary democracy, so it's not like as it is in the U.S., you go to the elections on November 3rd, and a new president moves in January 20th, so you have all this time to, for this transition. Here, right, the new coalition is created overnight, and then the next day, the new prime minister goes to work. So you don't have that 2-month period. What you generally do have, though, is you have the prime minister, the outgoing prime minister. And again, we haven't had that many transitions over the last couple of decades, but when we have had them, right, you've got the outgoing prime minister sit down and do a transition with the incoming prime minister. Netanyahu spent about 25 minutes with Bennett in this transition period. And there was, a lot was made of that here, in this country, that, that's not enough time. When you send your kid out to the grocery store to tell them to buy some groceries, you spend more than 25 minutes telling them what to buy, right? So it was clear that, that the Netanyahu was reluctantly handing over the reins of power, but he handed over the reins of power, and he did it without a capital moment, without any violence, without all the disruption that a lot of people, were naysayers were worried that was going to happen here. That didn't happen.
And was there some, from what you just said, I'm sensing that perhaps there wasn't as much information sharing between the Netanyahu government and the Bennett-led government. So that aspect of it could have been improved.
That aspect of it could have been improved, definitely. Look, there was transition. Bennett, he met with the head of the Mossad. By the way, we have a new Mossad head right now, too. Israel, in the space of a week, got a new president, a new head of the Mossad, a new prime minister, and a new government. Bennett met the heads of the security services, the head of the Mossad, the head of the army. So it's not as if he's going in there with a blank slate. He didn't apparently get as in-depth a briefing from the prime minister as would have been expected or would have been liked. Like a lot of the things, a lot of the agreements that, or the conversations that the prime minister, that Netanyahu had with Biden or with Putin, A lot of that maybe hasn't been written down anywhere. It's in his head. It would have been behooving upon him to probably share more of that with Bennett. He didn't do that. But again, a lot of that information is in the heads of other people as well. And those people did meet with Bennett, and he has gotten, briefings from them, I think, very intensively.
All right. Well, the past few months has definitely been an exciting one in Israeli politics. And it seems, at least for now, the political stalemate inside the country has come to an end with the formation of Israel's 36th government. Herb, well, I would love to continue this discussion. I do have to make some time for the Q&A and for the audience's questions. So on that note, I will hand the baton to Nisha. And thank you, Herb, for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Herb, and thank you, Shaheen. This has been so interesting. And we have received some questions from our audience, and I would just encourage people to continue to add their questions to the chat as we move along here. But I think I'll get us started with a question from Luisa, who was curious, and I think it's a great question because it comes to, the perspective of an American alumnus and the American public, really, as they think about some of these questions about Israel's new government and how they respond. And so, in short, Luisa's question is, how does the Israeli public respond to a government without a budget? It seems surreal that there hasn't been one since 2018. Is the public aware of this? If so, how is the government funded? So if you could, Herb, give us a sense of how the process works in Israel, what the public's expectations are, and indeed, what decisions the government has not been able to make precisely because there hasn't been a current budget in place.
I mean, that's a good question. Again, the budget, what happens is that if there isn't a budget that's passed, you're working off of the last budget, right? So which was in 2018. So it's not as if, the money stopped flowing, but there wasn't any additional money for ministries. Ministries were unable to take on new projects, right? Certain NGOs weren't getting funded. I think I'm not sure the degree to which people understand how much this impacts on their daily life, but at a certain point in time, I think, the population also just got fed up with it, especially as it faced the prospect of perhaps going back to even a fifth election, right? There was a lot of pressure on the parties this time to just get it done, right? Just forget it already, get it done, because we can't go on like this anymore. As far as, how the government operates or how it's able to make decisions, you have a transition government in place, right? Netanyahu was the prime minister of a transitional government, right? They were able to make decisions. They carried out a major military campaign against Hamas in Gaza under a transitional prime minister. So it does work. By the way, I think one of the reasons that the Hamas kind of initiated that by flying rockets onto Israel was because it didn't think that a transitional government without the legitimacy of a full-fledged prime minister would be able to commit troops and to take this kind of action. So the government did operate. What was the problem? The problem was that every decision the government made was seen through the prism of is Netanyahu doing this for political reasons, right? Is he taking action against Hamas because he thinks this will help him politically, or because this is the right thing to do? So whenever a decision was made, same on Corona, right? Is he making this decision on Corona because it's good for the country, or is it good for him politically? And I think people got fed up with that and just wanted to see that come to an end, and that we don't have to go back to a fifth election.
Terrific. We have a bunch of questions for you, Herb, and time is limited. So I'm going to do my best to try to cluster questions on topics together so that you can address them and as efficiently as possible. We've received a couple of questions about the impact of the new government, the way that the new government would manage U.S.-Israel relations. Where do you expect continuity? Where do you expect difference? We have Rivlin in town here in Washington, D.C. just yesterday. Could you speak to that a little bit? And in particular, talk about the way that you expect the government to manage the questions relating to Israel's security in Iran in ways that differ from that of their predecessor.
Look, as far as policy with the U.S., I think you're going to see a continuity of policy. You're going to see a difference in tone, right? There's no big differences really between this government and Netanyahu about Iran or about the Iranian nuclear agreement. Netanyahu was dead set against it, and this government is dead set against it. What you're going to see different, though, is how to deal with that. Where Netanyahu kind of took a confrontational tone towards, or at least he did towards President Obama, you're not going to see this from this government, I think. Netanyahu did not want, in fact, he forbade Israeli officials to deal with the Biden administration as far as details and negotiations with the Iranians. Right? He didn't want to give Israeli input into the negotiations because he thought by doing that he was going to legitimize the agreement, and he would be unable afterwards to act inside Iran against it. So his policy was, we're not talking to our good friends Americans about this agreement. This new government is taking a different approach, right? They're saying we're against the agreement. We think it's a bad agreement. We think it's detrimental to Israel's security, but we're going to deal with the government to try to see how we can perhaps improve it, or even more so, how we could set red lines as to what is going to happen if the Iranians don't live up to it. So as far as tone, I think what you're seeing is a very different tone, a very different approach. Although again, overall, the content of being opposed to it is still very much the same.
Terrific. And by the way, Raymond Termini asked a couple of questions along these lines related to Iran, and I think you covered one of them, but he made some really interesting points, namely that, it's unlikely, as you said, that Prime Minister Bennett and President Biden will reach a meeting of the minds on what should be included in the new agreement and any new agreement with Iran. But further to that, he asked, what is the most that Bennett can hope to get from Biden on this issue? And how will the Israeli public and political parties accept it?
Look, as far as what Bennett hopes to get from Biden, that's tough to say. Again, I think I think everybody on both sides of the ocean realize that the Americans know our position, we know their position, and we just have a different view of how this thing should be going down. I think what Bennett, what Israel, what input they can do is, like I said, kind of determine the red lines afterwards. Well, what you have the agreement, but what happens if Iran continues with its malign activity in Syria and in Yemen and in Gaza and in Lebanon? Then what actions might the U.S. take, or what actions are legitimate for Israel to take? What happens if they try to move ballistic missiles from Iran through Syria into, precision ballistic missiles from Iran through Syria into Lebanon? I think those kind of expectations are being discussed, number one. The second major discussion, I think, has to do, well, if you do go ahead with this agreement, how can Israel's military capacity be built up? How can America build up Israel's military capacity to have to take on Iran if they breach the agreement?
Great. And a little bit more on back to the internal Israeli politics, if you will, instead of the focus on U.S.-Israel. Two questions from Ray Rafidi. Do you see President Herzog as being more engaged in mediating between the Bennett, Lapid, and coalition partners than his predecessors. And second, on the surface, Yair Lapid seems more of a centrist, while Bennett is firmly established on the right. Should the current arrangement run its course and the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister switch as planned in 2023, what kinds of problems, for example, the Israel-Palestinian relationship, Israel's economy, the budget, what kinds of problems arise in light of the diversity of the coalition, the breadth that you mentioned a couple times in your remarks, to say nothing of the various political priorities that are represented in Israel's Knesset? How do you see that playing out?
Let me tackle the second part first, because I'll remember it better that way. As far as, look, this is rotation government, right? Meaning, or rotation prime minister, meaning in 2 years, Lapid is supposed to take over. But I don't envision any, huge shifts from right to left when this happens, right? Because again, like I said, Lapid right now has veto power over Bennett. Bennett is not going to be able to run with his, ideological agenda because he's unable to do it because of the structure of the government. Lapid isn't going to be able to do it either. So I think what you're going to see is they're going to try to look for this middle ground. And I think the search for this middle ground will begin with the Bennett government, and then it's going to continue with when Lapid takes over, because these wide ideological shifts, the structure of the government with each side having a veto power over the other, it just doesn't allow for it. Also, we've had rotation governments in the past. Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres were very different ideologically in the 1980s. They rotated the government. You didn't see a huge dramatic shift. So I don't really envision that being a problem. And the second question was an interesting question about President Herzog. Is he going to play more of a political role? I kind of doubt it, because I don't think he wants to be seen as a political being. Right, the presidential term here is for 7 years. Who knows how long this government is going to last? I don't think he's going to be, wanted to be seen on either side of the ideological spectrum. I think if he's called upon, he'll perhaps, try to give advice where he can. But I don't see him inserting himself into the political process, because I think that in the long run, that would kind of undercut his position as president, a position which is, you're supposed to be above all that. So if he wants to keep the integrity of his office, I think he'll try to stay away from that, much as Rivlin did. Right? I think Ruby Rivlin did that. I think he was successful in doing that, and I think that's also one of the reasons that he was pretty popular.
Perfect. Well, we have a lot of additional questions and not very much time. But in a couple of moments, could you quickly respond to the question from an alumnus in South Africa, actually, asking, how do the Arab parties regard the Iran deal? Have they spoken out about it publicly? And another question, does the approval for the March of Flags rally a few weeks ago and the assertive response to the balloon attacks from Gaza signal a tone for the government's foreign policy approach moving forward? Let's see, what else can I get you to think about before we close? Oh, and finally, can you try, do the best you can from your perch as a long-term, a watcher of the Israeli scene? Can you try to address, if you could, what do you think the Israeli public in general is looking for from this new government that they didn't get during the 12-year era of Netanyahu? What are they looking for, and what are their expectations?
That's a good question, and I think they're looking for something very simple, and that's stability and some quiet, right? Netanyahu, people, long have looked at the Israeli political scene and divided into the right and the left, based on your position on the Palestinian issue, on the settlement issue. Over the last 2.5, 3 years, that was not the dividing line. the dividing line was Netanyahu, right? Do you love him or do you hate him? Is he great or was he a goof, right? That was the dividing line. And I think that people just got sick of just hearing about it, right? Well, even those who like Netanyahu, they just, many of them thought, enough already, right? There's just too much noise. There's just too much smoke. It's just taking up too much room. It's just sucking all the oxygen out of the room. So I think, you ask what the Israelis are looking for in this government, stability, right? Give us a government that lasts for 2 years, right? We'll be in heaven, and quiet. So we don't have to deal every day with what Netanyahu said or he didn't say, or what his wife or his kids said or didn't say. Just gonna leave us alone, do your business, govern, and let us go on with our lives. I think in a nutshell, that kind of sums up what the Israeli public are looking for. As far as the question about the Arab parties and Iran, haven't heard anything on that. That's a good question. The Arab parties haven't sounded off too strongly on what the Israel's policies towards Iran they would like to see. I haven't heard that at all. And the last question having to do with the flag march and the balloons, and is that instructive of what we can expect from this government? I think to a certain extent it is. We'll start with the flag march, right? What was the flag march? They're supposed to have this march in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day to go to the Western Wall, through the Damascus Gate, through the Muslim quarter, a very contentious, divisive march. It was pushed off because of the war. Then it was rescheduled. It was rerouted and rescheduled. Hamas said, don't hold it, right? If you hold it, you're going to set everything aflame again. You had a new government in power, and they could not, give in to Hamas here. I mean, no government would say, okay, Hamas, you over there in Gaza are going to dictate what we can do in Jerusalem and whether we're going to be able to have a march in Jerusalem. We're not going to cede that right to you. So I think they dealt with it pragmatically, in compromise. They said you could march, but not through this contentious route. You can march. And they marched and they went, and a couple thousand kids marched through the Jaffa Gate to the Western Wall. They waved their flags, and that was it. So I think that was a very pragmatic approach to it, which I think you can see going forward. And as far as the response, Bennett's response to the balloons, in which he kind of hit back in a way that Netanyahu had not done, I think that also sends a message. Look, the new prime minister, or any new prime minister, is going to be tested. Right? Hamas was testing him, wanting to see what they can get away with. And I think he was trying to send a message to them that, okay, there's a new prime minister in town, but our policies, at least on security issues, are going to be as tough, if not tougher, than our predecessor. I think that's the message he was trying to send with that.
Thank you so much, Herb. And I have to say that hearing you speak and the breadth and the scope of your answers really makes me look forward so much to the time when we can connect you with Project Interchange delegations again in Israel. Bezrat Hashem, the Delta variant will be dealt with, but our plan is to get people over to you in the fall, and we'll look forward to giving them the chance to hear from you directly, because it's just been fascinating. So thank you, and thank you, Shaheen, for doing the usual masterful job probing and expanding understanding of some really complex issues. So thank you both again. And before we go, I want to turn the program over for some concluding remarks to the Tower Center's Senior Associate Director, Ray Rafidi. So Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nisha. And Herb, thank you so much for staying up till 10 o'clock tonight. We're all craving Middle Eastern and Israel news here in Dallas, and I think everybody would agree we could make this go on forever and not be tired. This was wonderful, a fantastic presentation, and I can't thank you enough. And I also can't help but comment on your comments about how you would like to have or Israelis would like to have an evening where they can go to bed without having to hear from the Prime Minister and his kids. We feel your pain, but it's been nice for the past couple of months with that same sort of thing here. So thanks again. It was a wonderful presentation. As usual, this has been a wonderful collaboration with AJC. I forget how many things we've done with them so far, but it's been fantastic working with Joel, my good friend, and also fellow University of Arizona alumnus. We've just done some great things together, and we had the first one, the first of these two programs a couple of weeks ago or a couple of months ago, and then Joel reached out to me and said, "What about let's doing a follow-up since there is a government in place now?" So obviously, we readily agreed to that. As you can tell by the amount of participation locally, it's very popular here, and we really want the information. So again, kudos to AJC for all that you guys are doing and for working with us. We really love the relationship, and we'll keep it going. And Herb, once again, thank you for staying up late and giving us an insider's view of what's happening over there. I look forward to seeing you again soon, and take care, stay safe, and get some rest. Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Night.